Welcome everyone to the American Geosciences Institute's Critical Issues webinar series. My name is Charlotte Wood and I'll be moderating today's Critical Issues webinar, Making Produced Water More Productive. We'd like to acknowledge the co-sponsors of our webinar today, the American Association of Petroleum Geologists and the Association of American State Geologists. A big thank you to those two organizations. In today's webinar, we'll be having three speakers discussing produced water and alternative reuse and disposal options. First, Kyle Murray from the Oklahoma Geological Survey and the University of Oklahoma will be discussing geoscientific perspectives on produced water and saltwater disposal practices. We'll then hear from Jeri Sullivan-Graham from the Los Alamos National Laboratory, who will discuss non-traditional use and recycling options for oil and gas produced waters. Finally, we'll hear from Holly Perrin from the Environmental Defense Fund, who will talk about produced water reuse, the environmental risks and regulatory responses. The presentations will be followed by a panel discussion where questions from participants will be addressed by speakers. Now, I'll turn the slides over to Kyle Murray.
I want to thank AGI for organizing the webinar and for all of those that have joined us today to participate. I'm going to do the best that I can to cover a lot of ground in a short period of time, and I will talk about my research on produced water and saltwater disposal in Oklahoma and try to explain the relevant geologic conditions that affect produced water and how we manage that resource. The first slide, unfortunately, contains a lot of information, but it kind of sets the tone for my talk and will get you oriented to the state of Oklahoma, the formations of interest that are producers of oil and gas and therefore producers of produced water, salt water. And then the other slides following this will be fairly self-explanatory once you've got the groundwork. So let's start by looking at the stratigraphic column on the left side of the slide, which shows about 54 of the most prominent oil and gas producing formations in Oklahoma. You can see in the upper section we have primarily sandstone units that produce oil and gas, and they're mainly conventional types of reservoirs. In the lower sections we have carbonate units and shale units that produce oil and gas. And today, in present time, the Mississippian, the Woodford, the Devonian to Middle Ordovician, and the Arbuckle group are probably the most important in terms of the volume of water that's co-produced with oil and gas, and also as disposal zones. The Arbuckle predominantly is our disposal zone. So most of my slides will focus on those four zones and show you the trends that we see in oil and gas production, water production, and then water management. So these color codes hopefully are helpful to you. I have 10 zones that I typically will organize the data into, these 10 zones, with two miscellaneous categories that allow for younger zones or zones that are commingled together to be multiple and undifferentiated. So let's look at the chart on the bottom right to begin with to understand in the last 6.5 years what zones have been completed and the number of completions per month. So you can kind of see from this slide the color codes match the symbols on the left. The number of completions per month range from about 150 in the lowest months to as many as 375 or so completions per month. And of course, as oil prices were high and increasing, we had an increasing number of completions, specifically an increasing number in the Mississippian play in northern Oklahoma. And the Woodford has a consistent number of completions. The Devonian to Middle Ordovician has a pretty consistent number. But at the time that the price of oil dropped, you could see the number of completions per month also began to decline. And specifically, the number of completions in the Mississippian declined at that same type of rate. So this affects the produced water volume and how it changes in space and time in Oklahoma. In the upper right is the map view. The wells that were completed then started producing. Some of them did, from 2009 to 2015. So it gives you a sense of where those plays were active. In northern Oklahoma, you see a lot of these blue symbols. That's the blue that corresponds to Mississippian production. And so that's the primary producing zone in northern Oklahoma. We've got the Woodford play in the Anadarko Basin. If we move down to the Devonian to Middle Ordovician completions and those wells that started producing, we have several of those in the Cherokee Platform area, the Anadarko Shelf, and even in parts of the Anadarko Basin and down into the Ardmore Basin. And then the Arbuckle Group, there aren't a whole lot of producers in the Arbuckle Group. There may be a few scattered around the state, but primarily production is occurring from the Mississippian, Woodford, and Devonian to Middle Ordovician in those recently completed wells. And that affects the water production in statewide. If I might point out one other cluster of wells, this is the Granite Wash Group, which might include the Des Moines Age, Missourian Age, and Virgilian Age rocks and formations. Those are prominent producers in western Oklahoma. So to set the tone there, we have those primary zones, those 10 primary zones that I organized the data into. What I want to achieve is to be able to estimate produced water volumes. Since they're not currently reported by operators, I have to find a method to estimate them. So I organized the oil production by zone, those same 10 zones, and look at the production over time in the chart at the bottom and in space in the map at the top. So what I'm showing here, I think, is fairly self-explanatory. Production of oil in 2009 was primarily from the upper sandstone units, and maybe it was more conventional production at that time. But as we move forward in time, we have more unconventional production and dewatering and development of some of these carbonate-rich and shale-rich zones. So production from the Mississippian of oil certainly has increased as activity and completions increased in that zone. And then Woodford shale production, even though it's primarily a gas zone, there is oil production that has increased as well. It's interesting to look at what occurred after the price of oil dropped. The production of oil also has decreased. So we have to continue to complete new wells and develop new wells to maintain the same level of oil production. If we look at the map view, you can see where oil production was at its highest at a county scale. Woods County, Alfalfa County, and Osage County, that's primarily Mississippian oil production. And then in the south, maybe Stevens and Carter County, the darker shades, would be a combination of Woodford, Devonian to Middle Ordovician, Simpson Group probably in that area, Springer and some other zones. And then the Granite Wash, those younger sandstone-rich layers would produce oil in western Oklahoma. Gas trends look a little bit different statewide, and you can see back in 2009 we were producing most of the gas from the younger sandstone units, but over time the Woodford specifically has really been developed. So a lot of gas production from the Woodford. And the downturn in oil prices really hasn't affected gas production a whole lot. It looks like it's been pretty consistent since the price of oil dropped. If you look at the map view, you can see the primary gas production zones are in the Ardmore Basin, the Arkoma Basin, and then in the Anadarko Basin in areas of Oklahoma where gas has been produced in recent years. Some gas production in the north from the Mississippian and other units. So what does it mean in terms of water production? The approach that I've been using to estimate produced water really starts with understanding which zones produce oil and gas, and then computing from initial potential tests and production tests a ratio of water to oil and water to gas. and then using that as a multiplier to estimate co-produced water volumes. So trying to achieve co-produced water volumes by a scientifically defensible method, this is the approach that I use. What's shown in this foreground chart is the ratio of water to oil, and the inter 50 percentile, 25th percentile up to 75th percentile, with the median where the light color meets the dark color. So this is the ratio or the range of ratios that I would expect to see in a variety of tests that are done by zone. The median value is listed on the left. So as a starting point, if I wanted to estimate co-produced water volumes, I could take oil production from a specific zone, multiply it by the median, and I would have a ballpark figure for produced water volume. I have the same data in the background here for water to gas ratios, and again, apply the same methodology. So what I've done in recent weeks is try to refine this methodology and calibrate produced water estimates to the saltwater disposal volumes that I've been tabulating over the same period of time. And so the stars that you see on these slides represent the ratios that I think are most consistent or give me the best fit to the saltwater disposal volumes. So after calibration, so to speak, the ratios, for example, in the Mississippian, the ratio of water to oil appears to be much higher. It gives me a better fit in my model. And the ratio of water to gas in the Devonian to Middle Ordovician, which includes the Hunton, and even water to oil in the Devonian to Middle Ordovician is much higher. So that tells me that based on this approach, the produced water volumes will be much higher in areas that are producing from the Mississippian and the Devonian to Middle Ordovician. So that plays itself out pretty clearly in this slide, which shows again the time scale or temporal scale in the bottom in the chart. Back in 2009, our production from the Devonian to Middle Ordovician really made up the majority of the produced water, generated the majority of the produced water. As the production shifted to Mississippian and still included Devonian to Middle Ordovician, the water production from the Mississippian certainly increased and became the majority of our produced water. After the downturn, the oil prices change. That affects water production as operators shift from maybe water producing zones to lower water producing zones. And we see an estimate of produced water that's also declining in recent months. So in map view, you can see the summary: Woods County, Alfalfa County, major water production zones. That's Mississippian production. And then in central Oklahoma, Oklahoma County, Lincoln County, Seminole County, that's where we have a lot of Devonian to Middle Ordovician production and probably Hunton dewatering activity that's associated with that. So what do we do with produced water once it comes out of the ground? This is a portion of a diagram that I've drawn that shows flow of water through the oil and gas sector. And this is the portion that I'm talking about today, produced water. In many cases, operators are treating it to clean brine and reusing it for frac jobs and additional drilling and completion. In other cases, we may use it for enhanced oil recovery and water floods, which you saw in this diagram to the bottom. But today I'm going to summarize or wrap up my talk with where does the water go and into saltwater disposal wells, specifically in Oklahoma. So produced water is largely generated, it seems, in the Mississippian Play in northern Oklahoma and Devonian to Middle Ordovician group in central Oklahoma, with some other pockets of high water production. But where does it go back into the subsurface in saltwater disposal wells? The same zones that I showed earlier, now showing saltwater disposal, and the dominant zone for saltwater disposal in Oklahoma is the Arbuckle. So we take water out of the Mississippian, Devonian to Middle Ordovician primarily, and then it goes back into the Arbuckle. And so because the Arbuckle is so overwhelming in terms of the volume of saltwater disposal, I'd like to look at that as a separate slide and show you the distribution of Arbuckle disposal wells, which are mostly in the Anadarko Shelf region or province and the Cherokee Platform geologic province. In other areas, the Arbuckle is either very deep or not present. So the Arbuckle disposal wells really correspond to zones that I've estimated to have the highest produced water volumes. So the increase in produced water volumes over time do correlate pretty strongly with the increase in saltwater disposal into the Arbuckle. To wrap it up, I have a few take-home messages for you. Dewatering in Oklahoma seems to yield more produced water than unconventional shale development. The Woodford Shale is obviously a prominent gas-producing zone, but it's not a big water producer. Our water production really comes from those carbonates. And the rate of water production, I think, is strongly related to the market. So oil prices drop, operators will move away from water, essentially. To allow for us to improve our ability to recycle and reuse water, we do need some regulatory controls and help and innovation. So pooling is one of the strategies that we really need to begin to adopt here in Oklahoma. And if we want to use or reuse water outside of the oil and gas industry, desalination is one of the requirements. That salty water needs to be desalinated and reused elsewhere. And in terms of saltwater disposal and how we manage that resource, the cost is really largely a function of how far we move the water before it's disposed. So the operation and maintenance cost really is tied up in transport of that water. Thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions.
Holly, are you prepared to present right now?
Sure.
Thank you very much. We appreciate that.
So as Charlotte said, I'm Holly Perrin. I'm a senior attorney on the oil and gas team at the Environmental Defense Fund. EDF is an international environmental nonprofit with about 1 million members worldwide. And we're science-based and, where possible, advocate for market-based solutions to environmental problems. My area of focus is oil and gas, and this presentation will cover a brief overview of the risks associated with reuse of produced water and emerging regulatory responses. There are big opportunities here, and with that come some fairly significant risks as well. Reusing oil and gas wastewater makes a lot of sense in theory. We produce 800 billion gallons of wastewater from oil and gas operations every year. And in some arid parts of the country, recycling the wastewater could reduce pressure on freshwater sources. But this comes with a big caveat. Recycling itself isn't easy, and it doesn't always make economic sense, and it's certainly not risk-free. So before we jump into infrastructure and systems that incentivize recycling, we need to make sure we're not causing more problems than we solve. There are two sort of big categories of risks associated with recycling that I'll introduce today. The first is risk of spills and leaks of minimally treated water. And the second is uncertainty about the constituents in the wastewater, how to analyze them, how to treat the constituents, and how toxic they are to humans, aquatic, and terrestrial systems, like plants, bugs, and soil. So the risks of spills and leaks at the surface are significant, and we're really not solving water shortage issues if we contaminate existing sources. A GWPC study released in 2012 indicates that spills at the surface cause 70% of the groundwater contamination associated with oil and gas production. Because recycling entails more intensive handling of wastewater, the risks of spills and leaks are also greater than simple disposal. It just means that you're handling the water more, storing it in larger volumes, and transporting it more. And then I think it's important to note that reuse within the field usually entails less robust treatment than for other potential reuses. Increasingly, operators are able to use higher TDS water in their base and makeup fluids, and it's not cost-effective to fully treat wastewater before transporting and reusing downhole. And that makes sense, but it also means that the wastewater will still contain many constituents that could be damaging if spilled or of unknown toxicity. And so this risk isn't speculative, right? The amount of wastewater spilled from oil and gas operations is increasing, even though production is declining. Even though spill data is incredibly difficult to obtain, the states that do collect and make transparent their records show more and more spills. Data compiled by EE News shows that the national spill rate increased in 2013 by 17%. And the New Mexico Legislative Financial Services compiled data for the state of New Mexico in 2014, and their data showed that the volume of wastewater and fluids associated with oil and gas operations increased by 61%, while the rate of oil production increased 23%. And I think part of this could be explained by the increasing trend to keep water at the surface longer and move it around more, which creates opportunities for leaks and spills and tanks and pipelines and pits. So states have responded to the demand for recycling with new regulations that make it easier to reuse water. This first wave of recycling regs streamlined permitting for pits, tanks, and recycling facilities, which is somewhat counterintuitive if you're worried about leaks and spills without good enforcement and robust requirements initially for design and construction. States like Texas and New Mexico passed rules that specifically encourage recycling and make it easier to do by authorizing it and approving certain infrastructure if it meets certain specifications. And I'll note that North Dakota, Ohio, Colorado, New Mexico, Texas, they all have rules that specifically apply to saltwater, produced water, or recycling facilities. But I'll use Texas as an example. It was the first recycling rule per se, and it's been somewhat of a template for the recycling rules that followed. And under Rule 8, you don't need a permit to construct a pit used in recycling operations as long as the pit meets certain standards. It must be lined. You must have 2 feet of freeboard. Single-line pits must be emptied annually and inspected, or you can use a double-lined pit with leak detection, among a couple other things. And these are fairly good. Leak detection and repair and inspection, particularly on a regular basis. It's fairly good regulations, and streamlining the regulations as these rules do isn't necessarily bad per se, but it does make enforcement and ensuring rules are followed even more important to ensure that pits and tanks used to store this minimally treated water doesn't leak out onto soil and waterways. Another emerging trend is a set of specific regulations pertaining to pipelines that transport oil and gas wastewater. North Dakota's legislature just passed a bill last session, HB 1358, requiring operators of buried wastewater pipelines to submit a bond and certain maintenance, operation, construction, and design information to the NDIC. They also directed EERC, the University of North Dakota's research arm, to study wastewater pipelines and the cost efficiency of leak detection and repair. And that report was published last week, and I'd encourage you all to take a look at it. They did a good job. And another pipeline regulation that we might see emerge is in Pennsylvania. Their DEP included pipeline regs in the draft Chapter 78 rules. And those draft rules contain a lot of really interesting protective conditions, such as daily inspection while the pipeline is in service, and shutoff valves that would limit spills to 1,000 barrels. And the other big area for reuse of produced water, or I should say interest in produced water, at least in the West right now, I know Jeri will talk about some other non-traditional uses, is reuse for things like de-icing, agriculture, and wildlife. Some of this is facilitated in the West by an exemption to the statutory prohibition on discharge of oil and gas wastewater, a 40 CFR 435 subpart E that allows discharge of wastewater west of the 98th meridian if the water is of good enough quality for agriculture and wildlife. And that's a direct quote from the regulations, of good enough quality for agriculture and wildlife. The problem is how to define what good enough means. The regulations governing water quality and health don't cover many of the pollutants found in oil and gas wastewater. This is the fundamental problem. Our water quality and drinking regs don't fully overlap with all the constituents that you may find. A couple things explain this. First, current EPA analytical methods don't perform well in high TDS environments characteristic of oil and gas wastewater, and they don't necessarily detect at very low levels in those environments, even though some of the constituents can be toxic at very low levels. So measuring the constituents is difficult. Second, EPA in their I usually say hydraulically fracturing, and I'm trying to think of a more technical or a politically appropriate term, but in their drinking water assessment said that we lack chronic toxicity data for 80% of all the 1,100 pollutants that may be found in oil and gas wastewater. So we really only understand the effects of 20% of what's in the water, and not always the full chronic toxicity, right? Such as the effects on plants, soils, or aquatic ecosystems. According to our analysis of the 134 chemicals identified by EPA's drinking water assessment as being present in oil and gas wastewater, less than half, 60, are on the priority pollutant list, which forms the backbone of many environmental protection regulations on average. Less than 30 are contained in NIPDES permits, typically issued for industry facilities. And less than 20 are on the effluent guidelines for centralized wastewater treatment facilities, the commercial treatment facilities that typically receive oil and gas wastewater. Irrigation or agricultural water quality standards don't address these oil and gas constituents either. And so typically, standards published by FAO, USDA, and Extension Services address TDS through chlorides, SAR, EC, and general water quality parameters like pH, boron, and nitrate concentrations, and a host, about 20 inorganic constituents based on observed phytotoxicity. These are some of the examples you might see. There's a real gap here in the research and standards. There's an immediate need for additional research into chronic toxicity of many of the constituents found in produced water, and not just for human toxicity. Plant, soil, terrestrial ecosystem impacts, how some of these constituents persist in soils and sediments, bioaccumulate, and their effects on bugs and fish, and fate and transport generally in the environment is critically important to inform beneficial use. And this is particularly important now and emerging now because previously the salt content alone of many of these alternative water sources would knock those sources out of contention. But current treatment capabilities are becoming more economically feasible, and the TDS can be removed, but many constituents may remain. And those remaining constituents may or may not have known toxicities, and may or may not, but most often do not, have regulatory limits. The state regulations governing this particular beneficial use of produced water outside the oil field is really another unknown in many places. Because this is a new process, there really isn't a clear path to permitting or regulation in most states. And it can involve many agencies that are different in different states. But in general, you're probably touching on the jurisdiction of 3 or 4 agencies. First, the oil and gas agencies that govern oil and gas activities and E&P waste, which produced water is considered. And your oil and gas agency will govern things like pits, tanks, drilling, disposal options, infrastructure, things like that. The state environmental agencies with primacy, or EPA in some states, regulate discharges of pollutants to surface waters of the state, and therefore may be involved in determining protective application levels and treatment standards. And the waste divisions, or these might be contained in the environmental agency or in a health department, govern waste handling, disposal, and classification, and may have a specific beneficial use program for RCRA substances that could be expanded or massaged to include this category of reuse. And finally, some states, particularly in the West, have an agency to administer water rights, which would govern the type or types of uses to which the water may be put, and how and whether the water can be transferred and owned. And this isn't necessarily a government regulation yet, but another legal concern that may influence beneficial reuse that could be covered by statute, but may also be defined in case law, is the state's tort liability framework. And you know, despite some of the unknowns, based on demand, some states are forging ahead with regulations that specifically address recycling and reuse of produced wastewater. As I mentioned earlier, Texas's Rule 8 was the first to address recycling. And Rule 8 specifically encourages recycling of produced water, allows it in the field for downhole uses without a permit, and also authorizes the use of distilled water for any purpose other than discharge into surface waters, and uses permitted by another state or federal agency. Other than reuse downhole, reuse of distilled water, and reuse under another permit, additional uses may be permitted on a case-by-case basis by the Railroad Commission. The RRC issued their first recycling permit for the Pecos pilot project, and Jeri will cover in detail. The permit addressed some of the spill risks by limiting the amount of water that could be stored on the site at any one time, 1,000 barrels of untreated water and 3,000 barrels of treated water, and also prohibited runoff from the facility after application. And as for water treatment and quality, the permit delegated the specifications to the irrigator researchers, who are terrific. By the way, Katie Lewis is doing really interesting work here. And the list of analytes that Texas A&M tested for is up on the screen. And I understand that the main limitation on this analyte list might have been funding. They had no outside funding for this. So there's a real opportunity to expand research in this area to evaluate things like organics or perhaps a whole effluent toxicity analysis. New Mexico's rule is very similar to Texas's Rule 8. The Oil Conservation Division in New Mexico passed a rule last March that encourages recycling similarly and streamlines permitting and regulations pertaining to recycling and recycling infrastructure. New Mexico's rule authorizes by rule recycling for downhole uses and states that other uses will be permitted after a case-by-case evaluation. The rule also specifically calls out pilot projects with favor, I would add, and will allow these after review by the division. So clearly they're forward-looking in this regulation. Wyoming is a great example of how these states are addressing this potential reuse very differently. Wyoming's Department of Environmental Quality issues permits for discharge to the surface that consider the subsequent beneficial use. So Wyoming has a long history of discharge of oil and gas waste based primarily on the prevalence of coal bed methane wastewater in the Powder River Basin. However, DEQ also has a specific permit application that addresses discharges of other types of oil and gas wastewater. As part of the application to discharge to surface waters, new applicants have to certify that the water will be beneficially used for agriculture or wildlife. Part of the permit analyte list is copied here. Applicants for this permit must test their discharge and keep it below these established limits, which I'll mention don't necessarily include some of the things we would expect to find in produced water. These are three good examples. They're obviously not all of the states that are dealing with this, but I can answer specific questions if you have them later. So after identifying some of the risks and the regulatory responses, I think the takeaway is really to proceed with caution on this one. Regulations in many states lay the foundation for recycling and beneficial use of produced water outside the oil field, or at least projects that will explore this potential reuse. The question is, will the permits and the regulations, the new regulations, contain terms and conditions that are sufficiently protective of human health and the environment, even though it's still unknown exactly what pollutants are in the water, how they can be tested and treated, and then exactly how toxic the constituents may be to humans, plants, soils, and aquatic ecologies. I want to clarify that recycling and reuse does show a lot of promise in theory, and the purpose of regulations really isn't to obstruct this potential, but it's essential to proceed with caution, because we're only going to exacerbate water shortages if we pollute existing freshwater supplies. And we certainly don't want to trade one environmental problem for another by moving too quickly. And I'd be happy to answer questions afterwards.
Great, thanks Holly. I'll now turn the slides over to Jeri Sullivan-Graham, who will discuss non-traditional use and recycling options for oil and gas produced waters.
Thanks for having me. Thank you, Charlotte, and thanks to AGI for organizing this and for the invitation to present. I very much appreciate it. This is a real hot topic, I can tell you. Right now I work at Los Alamos National Lab, but I also work part-time with the New Mexico Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department, where we are examining the potential use and beneficial use of both brackish and produced waters. If you saw USA Today, you might have noticed a very large headline and study that they are publishing regarding the shortages of groundwater in the West. And that is why we're looking at this water. 15 years ago, when I started looking at produced water as a potential resource, people thought I was nuts because it can be very contaminated. And so the idea of using it, reusing it, really wasn't on the radar. And now it is. And that's because we are very short on water. The region is very delicately balanced in terms of water supplies and demands. New Mexico is completely allocated in terms of fresh water. So as climate changes and energy production changes, people move where their population changes are happening. We are getting various disruptive events like fires and floods, infrastructure failure. We really do need to look at alternative resources for water supply. So where can we use produced water? And I'll note this list is a list that I've put together not only for produced water, but for brackish water. Both of these kinds of resources they're like a square peg in a round hole. They don't fit well with our traditional concept of using fresh water and treating fresh water, delivering fresh water for use. Fresh water is our very easy water resource to implement. However, these more complex waters and more saline waters are going to be more difficult. It's going to take more effort in terms of looking at infrastructure, safe use, and regulation. So one of the most important things is availability. Is the water in the right place at the right time at the right volume? Oil and gas fields are not always located where population centers are, for example. Treatment is a big thing. It's going to be expensive. There are metals, suspended solids, scale-forming minerals, biological constituents, and organic compounds that we'll need to pay attention to and probably remove depending on the use. There's also questions about liability, risk perception, and use acceptance. Who owns the water? Does it belong to the surface owner or the mineral rights owner? And who bears the liability if something undesirable like a spill happens? There may be skepticism in terms of human uses like irrigation. Holly was talking about this. We could even say drinking water. What if we took this to drinking water standards? It is possible, but it's probably way too expensive, and there's likely to be questions. However, there are other uses, industrial use and possibly biofuel production and co-product production from biofuels, where this water might be very useful. We have to be safe and consider the environment when we are using this kind of water, and there's a number of considerations, not just spills, but also the operations, non-impingement on freshwater resources. If we extract brackish or produced water, we don't want to also co-extract fresh water. What's the long-term sustainability of the resource? Are we going to have to plan for obsolescence? And then what kinds of hydrologic studies and regional basin studies might we need to understand this water use in the environment? Policies are adapting, as we've seen, and regulations are adapting. There are regulations that may promote or inhibit the use of these waters, and we're going to have to take a close look at those and make sure they fit the type of water that we have. There's also a market. You have to have a customer who will buy the water, and they're probably going to want to buy it at the right price. Scarcity, however, tends to make the perceived price of water go up. If you think you've got a scarce water supply, then you're going to be willing to pay more. Infrastructure investment, we will need somewhat different infrastructure to prevent spills. This incurs more costs. There's, of course, transport, treatment, waste disposal, et cetera. And then how do you finance this, either public financing or private financing or with partnerships? So there's a lot of things that will need to be considered. There's a lot of moving parts. In New Mexico, we've been looking at the regulatory framework for reuse, and Holly gave a nice start to this. On the left-hand side of the screen, I've shown the areas that are under the jurisdiction of the New Mexico Oil Conservation Division. And as Holly mentioned, we have a new regulations for recycling and reuse. As long as this water stays within the oil and gas production and operation, there's no permit needed, although there are specific requirements. You can treat this water and put it back into the system. The waste disposal process also stays in the system, and uses case by case are also able to be considered. However, once we treat this water or move it over into the freshwater regime, which is governed by our state engineer, then we start looking at a completely different system, a completely different regulatory system. We have water rights and water permits that are important. And of course, if there's a spill, our environment department takes over and has jurisdiction there. And again, the liability issue comes into question. So there's a lot of things along that fuzzy dividing line down the middle that will need to be looked at and better defined so that we can use these waters. Some alternative uses for produced water. As I mentioned, reuse in oil and gas production is a really logical place for produced water to be used. There's a clear regulatory pathway. Hydraulic fracturing is reusing produced water quite a bit right now. And there's also some other examples. I'll bring up one called about steam flooding that's being done in California and some of the oil fields there. Irrigation is one that's always brought up. I hear this all the time. After treatment or dilution, irrigation is a potential use for produced water. I will show an example of rangeland rehabilitation, some work that was done at Los Alamos and Sandia with some small businesses several years ago in northern New Mexico. And then, of course, the most recent study on growing a non-food crop, which is cotton. Algal biofuel production is something we've looked at as well. This is an interesting and somewhat new way to look at using produced water. It's like a new energy versus old energy. And then another example might be potash mining. This has been proposed but is not yet enacted in New Mexico. However, I'll note that solution mining using saline water is a very good way to extract potash. Right now they're using brackish water. The alternative would be that they would use fresh water with added salt. And so we prefer that they use water that's already salty rather than taking up fresh water. So it's a potential good use of produced water if we can get the quality issues resolved. For hydraulic fracturing, there are a number of reuse criteria that are important. They may not always be what you think would be important. Of course, some of the critical treatments would include removal of solids, total suspended solids, free and colloidal oil. Microbe removal is very important. Uncontrolled microbial growth in wells can cause corrosion and clogging and other problems. Iron and flock formation is very important. Need to get the iron out. Ion balance is also important both for formation interactions and mineral scale inhibition. And then boron is a problem for the additives they use during fracturing. Less critical is pH and salinity. Hydraulic fracturing processes now can utilize very high salinities, which is a good thing because salt removal is very expensive. There's a number of treatment options that are out there for saline waters. I won't get into this a whole lot, but bear in mind that membrane methods are usually the most common methods we know of. They are usually used for seawater. That's the type of desalination that we know the best. Always bear in mind that there is a concentrated waste that must be disposed at a cost when you do a separations process like a membrane method or a thermal method. You will have some fresher water, but you also will have a waste. And so when you're inland, that means injection for disposal or perhaps evaporation ponds. Thermal methods are starting to be used more frequently. This is just a fancy way of boiling water, essentially, making sure that we control the heat and the thermal processes. Solar thermal is something that's also a potential new way for separating fresh water from saline water, and it is being used for produced water. Again, you also have a concentrated waste that you're going to need to dispose ultimately. And then there are some hybrid methods, membrane distillation and low temperature thermal distillation. Some of these have some improving cost profiles, which is a good thing. Also, electrocoagulation and capacitive deionization are possibilities. However, they're most useful for specific constituents or lower salinities. And I could answer some more questions about these methods, but we'll keep moving along. I want to thank Kent Adams from BOPCO. They recently did a study where they looked at the costs of freshwater consumption versus produced water consumption, both with treatment and without treatment, for a frac job. Their goal was to retain 100% of the produced water and retain the efficiency of their cross-linked gel so they could extract more gas. Freshwater has a cost, and in this case, they did not need to utilize fresh water, so that eliminated that cost of $250,000. They decided to try some treatment. Electrocoagulation was more expensive. They also did some just basic filtration, which was less expensive. Water transport costs were where the biggest cost was incurred, as well as pumping. So those are not necessarily something you think of immediately as a key for cost, but when you look at the final bottom line, the costs are not that different, and so reuse without treatment and without using fresh water is a very feasible option. Steam generation and aquifer recharge is done right now in San Ardo field in California. This is a heavy oil field. They are using reverse osmosis treatment to create water that is both discharged to basins for aquifer recharge and then for a steam generator, which has very high quality requirements. They're getting 75% recovery while reducing total dissolved solids and boron. They have a fairly complex process with oil removal, softening, filtration, and RO. So ultimately, they're able to retrieve 50,000 barrels per day of treated water for discharge. And I've got the reference here if you're interested in looking this up. Veolia is the company that's doing the work. The rangeland rehabilitation was work we did in Bloomfield, New Mexico. We had a coal bed methane water, not that salty. We did a number of steps, used a modified zeolite to remove coal fines and organics, and also dissolved turbidity and total iron. And this was a collaborative effort between ConocoPhillips and some small businesses, and was very successful. We had a temporary permit for rangeland rehabilitation up here. Cotton production was done using produced water. Katie Lewis is the researcher at Texas AgriLife. Just finished their study, I think, at the end of November. And they used a blended water, well water and produced water. Interestingly, the treated produced water was much lower in salinity than the well water that they used at the site. The treated produced water was actually an improvement on the water quality. It reduced the salinity, and they had improved growth with blended water. So a very interesting study. Finally, the algal biofuels. We took a look at where water needs would be for cultivation of algae. Algae for biofuels is going to need a lot of water. Fortunately, it doesn't need fresh water. So we looked at where there is very high evaporation, along with the needs for the algal biofuels. We also looked at where the oil and gas producing areas are in the gray. So the water needs are highest, of course, where the red is. We took a number of samples from different wells in different parts of the state, ended up doing some work down in the southeast corner with the folks at El Dorado Biofuels. And what we found is that we could take produced water, we could treat it using a multi-step process. This did not need to have salt removal, but we did some organics removal and reduction using filters, oil water separator, and stack scrubbing. And ultimately, we were able to use produced water for both lab, pilot, and also some field scale tests. And we had good recovery of algae and biofuel. We did find that high salinity tended to reduce our growth. And we also got very good quality when we started looking at additional uses of the algae for stock feed, for example. So the algae grown in produced water was just as good as algae grown in fresh water once we harvested it and took a look at it. So a lot of possibility there. I've included my contact information here, and then I've also included information for Katie Lewis as well, and I'm glad to answer any questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jeri. Next up is our panel Q&A session. Our first question is that, Kyle, in your talk, you mentioned that you can have more produced fluid than you actually get back oil. Is that the case in all places, in all states, or is that a rarity for Oklahoma?
I think there are some parts of Oklahoma where there's more produced oil or gas than water, but I think that's pretty limited. It's mostly, I would guess, the Granite Wash region in western Oklahoma, where they're more conventional sandstones. But I would imagine that the ratio of water to oil or gas is probably greater than 1 in most parts of the country, and absolutely in most parts of Oklahoma.
Great, thank you. The next question we have is that, can these reuse methods discussed for produced water from oil and gas be used for produced water from other processes like wastewater treatment and other industries?
Yes, indeed. Actually, produced water treatment often borrows from methods developed for other uses. So, for example, removal of organics using activated carbon or gas flotation. These are methods that have been developed for industrial uses already. There's a lot of crosstalk right now in adapting methods of treatment from industry to produced water, because produced water is a relatively complex water. So it's going to take a little bit of effort to try and best match the methods to the water.
Great, thank you. The next question is for Holly. Given the limitations in being able to analyze all of the constituents that may be found in produced water, as well as the lack of regulations for some of those constituents, is reuse for agriculture or other uses that involve exposing that water to the environment practical, or will we reach a regulatory paralysis?
I can't speak to whether we'll reach a regulatory paralysis. I do think that there's momentum behind the idea, and that regulators in many states are trying to work through this issue. And rightfully, they should be concerned about some of the unknown constituents and inability to test for them. That said, there may be options to use whole effluent toxicity evaluations to get at some of the unknown constituents or other protective measures. But I think proceeding slowly is probably the best course of action. I can't say whether that will be a full stop or not.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, how big of a problem is the disposal of recovered waste from the water purification process? So that relates to your talk, Jeri.
Well, one of the advantages that the oil and gas industry has is that they have a built-in disposal process that is already well understood and well covered in the regulation, and that is the use of Class 2 disposal wells. So that's why I like the idea of taking produced water and treating it for reuse, because you already have this process in place, and so it's well understood. And the key is going to be that having the treatment near where the disposal locations are. And if you start doing treatment elsewhere, then you've got a transportation issue. But if you keep your treatment near where this disposal infrastructure is, then you have a real advantage.
Great, thank you. The The next question is, have there been studies on oil and gas production after hydraulic fracturing when using produced water versus fresh water as a base for the frac fluid? And if there have been those studies, what have they shown? And anyone's welcome to answer that question if they know much about that.
Yeah, I haven't done those studies myself, but my understanding is that hydraulic fracturing with reused water or produced water tends to be create a better production well in the end, because you're using native formation water. As long as it's produced water from the same formation, it's going back into that formation in a new well, it tends to improve the production of the new completion. But I don't know exactly what source that's from. It's based on several talks that I've seen over the last few years.
This is Holly. I'll jump in and say that I have heard the same things Kyle just discussed, and will note that the research done may not be in the scientific community or peer-reviewed, but certainly the larger producers and service providers like Halliburton have evaluated that question and long-term effects of production. And so if you're interested in that work, I might look to those commercial sources.
Great, thank you. So the next question is for Jeri. Have zeolites or similar materials been used to try and selectively extract important or strategic materials from produced water?
Ooh, that's a good question. I know that zeolites have been used to extract, for example, radioactive materials from wastewaters. And I know that they can be used to extract certain cations from wastewaters. However, I am not aware of any studies where they have been used specifically for produced water, and as well as specifically for extracting valuable minerals. I think it would be a great area for future research, however.
Great. The next question is there concern about disposal or soil buildup of radionuclides from treatment or reuse of these waters?
I might answer that to some degree. I think that there certainly should be some concern, because the naturally occurring radioactive material norm typically is associated with calcium, magnesium, barium types of deposits that might occur in scaling. So if we dispose of produced water and there's an opportunity for those elements to precipitate out, the level of norm would probably increase along with the scaling material. So if it's not a concern or it's not on the radar, it should probably be on the radar for operators to make sure it's managed properly.
Great. We've got time for maybe a couple more questions. The next one is for Holly. How does New Mexico define a spill, and has that definition led to the increase of spills at all?
New Mexico has a fairly detailed definition of a wastewater spill or oil and gas fluid spill that I don't have at the top of my tongue. Certainly, the EE News study I cited does discuss the effect of a spill definition, a spill size definition, on the numbers. I think particularly that spill increase number in 2013 for North Dakota probably reflected a change in their definition of spill size. But unfortunately, I can't say exactly if that is the case for New Mexico as well. Maybe Jeri might have some insights.
I don't think the definition changed. I think if there was an increase in spills, it was likely just due to the increase in operations that happened with the upturn.
Great. And our final question will be that polluted water is often naturally remediated by soil. Why isn't this a solution for what to do with produced waters? Is it something to do with the nature of the produced water?
I think it goes back to the produced water. The constituent of greatest concern in my mind is the salt content, the high total dissolved solids concentration, which is very difficult for a natural system to remediate. Salt doesn't degrade and form its components, such as an organic material would degrade and form CO2 or methane and be broken down, but the salts don't really break down.
Great.
That's exactly right.
Agreed. Unless you have a mechanism to flush the salts, then they're going to remain in the soil.
Great. That's all of our questions for today's webinar. If you have any questions that weren't addressed today, you can email them to the address on the screen, which is cipinfo@americangeosciences.org, and we'll send our questions along to the speakers if they have a chance to answer them for you. We'll also be posting today's recorded webinar on our Critical Issues web pages soon, and you can visit the website also on the screen there to view this webinar as well as our previous ones.